a historical a short introduction that will be about a historical perspective on elite and popular culture. And this is basically about the things that I've been working on that has to do with this concept of two cultures. That is a concept that gained strength in the last half of the 19th century as a way of understanding both the Norwegian contemporary society in the 19th century, as well as an understanding of how to interpret Norwegian history. This concept has a lot to do with popular culture and elite culture, in my opinion. The main characteristic of this concept was a view that Norwegian society was separated by a schism between an elite that consisted of state-employed civil, religious, and military staff. And this staff was running basically the affairs of the Norwegian state and dominating the institutions and cultural life of the state. So you have kind of this elite of the Norwegians in the Norwegian society that is quite small. We measure it to be around 2,000 persons, and then family also beside, there are families beside that, that kind of where we have a term in Norwegian that is called embetsmann. It's not easy to directly translate it, but it is kind of all this staff that on a certain level in the Norwegian state that are hired both in the civil, religious, and military sector. On the other side, in Norway, this concept goes, you have the regular people, and in particular, then we can say the farmers. It's always a discussion if we should call them farmers or peasants or whatever, but we call them, I think farmers is the right terminology, because it's the farmers in Norway, most of them, many of them had quite some independence, and many of them also got the right to vote in 1814. But this regular people, they were kind of dominated by the elite, this concept goes. And I'll come back to that just here. What you can notice also is that the roots of this schism between an elite and popular culture or farmers, the root was to find in developments during the Danish-Norwegian Union and how society had developed then. In this concept, the elite represented a cultivated, often academic culture. Many of them were educated at the university in Copenhagen before the union ended in 1814. The Danish-Norwegian Union ended in 1814, and we got a new union between Norway and Sweden that year. So many of them were kind of academically educated. The elite, they were also considered foreign by kinship, and they were also often connected to the use of Danish language and the Norwegian language at this time, and still is the majority language. The written language was kind of inherited, let's say, to say it easy, from the Danish-Norwegian Union that ended in 1814. On the other side, we have farmers that represented the national culture, and they were considered to represent the national culture, and they were also considered more national by kinship, and they were considered national in the sense that they used the national language or dialects. Yes, so we kind of get this concept that is it is the kind of intellectuals that talk about this way of seeing Norwegian society in the 19th century, especially the second half of the 19th century. But the interesting part here is basically that this concept was used by as a tool in a way by a growing opposition of farmers, liberal members of free professions, and so on, against this traditional elite that was dominating the political and cultural institutions. It had different ways, and it had different characteristics, and I have to be very short here. But it had an historical part in the sense that it was kind of an emphasized the kind of anti-Danish narrative, emphasizing a continuous Norwegian culture also during the Danish-Norwegian Union. It had a linguistic side, as a new Norwegian language based on the dialects were introduced from the 1850s on. And this is what is today called New Norwegian, which is the minority language, written language in Norway. And these two languages are quite similar. Then it had also a side in the political struggle that happened in Norway in the 19th century. This concept of two culture was kind of an ideological tool to degrade the old elite from status and power and to give the opposition legitimacy. And the opposition then was organized in a party called Venstre, or the Liberal Party. And this Liberal Party came to power then in 1884. We cannot take the whole history about that here, but they kind of got the prime minister and headed the government, and the Conservative Party that was closer to the civil servants and so on, they had to leave power that year. So, and I will try to give a good example and keep my time frame. So the interesting thing here might be that maybe we can say that in the 19th century Norwegian history, we can see that the somewheres conquered power, both the cultural and political power, from the anywheres, because this this elite, the traditional elite, were in many ways maybe anywheres. But maybe we can discuss this later in the seminar today. Okay. Then I will give the word first to Kai Østberg, that is going to lead the seminar, and then David Goodhart will give his presentation.
Thank you, Jens, for this introduction. I am happy to give the floor to David Goodhart, who is the main guest here, and the author of the book about somewheres and anywheres. So you have the floor, David, please.
Okay, well, thanks, Jens, and thanks, Kai, and thanks for inviting me. Thanks for your interest in my book. Just to give a brief recap on how I came to write the book and how I've been developing these ideas more recently. The book, The Road to Somewhere, The Populist Revolt and the Future of Politics, was published in March 2017, it coming just a few months after the Brexit vote in the UK and the election of Donald Trump in the US in November of 2016. The book did quite well, partly I think because it was one of the that did quite well in the UK. It was briefly a bestseller just for 1 week at number 10. I crept into the bestseller list for 1 week, and that was, I think, mainly because of the timing. I was one of the first books in English to come along with a sort of general explanation for these two rather surprising events, and perhaps also the vividness of these words, anywhere and somewhere, that seemed to strike a chord. As I always say to people, I invented these labels. I certainly didn't invent the value groups that lie behind them. But I suppose I had been thinking, I mean, that Brexit and Trump were sort of fortuitous pegs in some ways for the ideas I'd been thinking about for a while, broadly in a sort of post-left v right context. I had been myself a relatively orthodox, for much of my adult life, I've been quite an orthodox supporter of moderate social democracy, of centre-left politics. I broadly supported the Tony Blair's New Labour Party when they won their famous victory in 1997. But I think it was actually partly through my interest in immigration that I became a little bit more skeptical about some of the kind of mainstream ideas of contemporary liberalism in Britain. And I think I became interested in how really one has to say, the most successful societies in human history, modern European rich welfare democracies in Western Europe and North America, although they're obviously distinct economic and political traditions in all our nations, and particularly between Europe and North America, but how it was that societies so rich, so free, so successful in so many ways were also creating such high levels of political discontent that were manifest even without Brexit and Trump. It was clear from the rising number of voters for populist parties. Indeed, there was a sort of premonition in some ways. I mean, 2016 was the big year with Brexit and Trump, you might say, but we'd had a sort of premonition of that in 2002 when the Netherlands suddenly flipped in its attitude to, or rather a real hostility to liberal multiculturalism emerged. We had Pim Fortuyn, the assassination of Pim Fortuyn, and all of that. I think it was 2002 that the French election was fought between Le Pen and Chirac. I can't remember exactly, but 2002 was like a sort of a first tremor of the earthquake that then happened in 2016. And I think what had happened was that you had this sort of accumulation of discontents. It's like sort of barnacles on the bottom of a boat that had really emerged in expressing discomfort with the new settlement that emerged in the early 90s, you might say, the kind of double liberalism that came to dominate the politics and economics of many rich countries. You had essentially the end of the Cold War. You had the emergence of a new, the so-called Washington Consensus around broadly market economics. I mean, sometimes with a welfarist and social democratic aspect to it, but most of the parties of the left in Europe and North America followed the lead of somebody like Robert Reich. If you remember Reich, who was Bill Clinton's Labour Secretary, wrote this famous book, The Work of Nations, sometime was it the late 80s, early 90s, in which he basically said, globalization is an enormously powerful and beneficial force in human history. It's raising the poorest countries through the openness of the global economy. We have to roll with this globalization. We have to accept this globalization. But we as parties of the, broadly speaking, parties of the left, centre left, the Democrats, Labour in Britain, the social democratic parties in Europe, it's our job to help the losers from globalization. We will retrain everybody, essentially, is what he said. The steel workers will be retrained as IT technicians. And I mean, of course, that didn't happen, at least didn't happen in the vast majority of countries. It happened a little bit. I mean, the other European country that I know reasonably well, because I worked there for a while, and I've written about it a bit, is Germany. And of course, in Germany, some of that retraining did happen. And the adjustment to globalization was more controlled in some more social democratic European states like Germany, with the co-determination system, the voice of organized labor in large corporations and so on. But so you had this period, I think Danny Roderick calls it hyperglobalization period, that caused huge expansion of financial services. We saw GATT being replaced by the World Trade Organization. We saw China entering the World Trade Organization in 2001. Suddenly this huge expansion of the global labor market. And all of this very much to the benefit of the highly educated, the academically educated, cognitive professionals in many of our countries did very well in this period, but many of the people who had the skilled and semi-skilled workers, usually men, clearly were the losers from this global rearrangement. And it was also accompanied by a set of views. I mean, I'll come to describe these as kind of the anywhere worldview in many ways, but you saw through the greater integration of the European Union, the shift towards more majority voting, the Maastricht Treaty, the move towards the euro, the abandonment of national currencies in large parts of Europe, the general weakening of national social contracts in the name of openness and economic growth, essentially. Sovereignty was exchanged in many countries for the promise of greater wealth, essentially. We saw, of course, so you had the emergence of this more open, more market-oriented, more liberal on the social and cultural side, generally, society. And you got, like I was saying earlier, a sort of accumulation of people who were either losing out from this very directly, people whose jobs were exported to China or Vietnam, or who were feeling uncomfortable about the pace of change. You also then had, prior even to the big shock of 2016 of Brexit and Trump, you had, of course, the financial crisis in 2008. And I think that had a kind of slow burn effect, or the financial crisis and the austerity that it led to in many, not all, but in many countries. And of course, you then had the refugee crisis of 2015, which seemed to symbolize to many ordinary people in Europe that we were, we'd been focused so much on abolishing the internal borders within Europe that we'd forgotten about the rather fundamental importance of having an external border, which the European elites seemed far less interested in establishing. So I think that was the kind of background to the book. I mean, I had, partly through my interest in immigration, I'd become more interested in what one might call the sort of social, cultural, almost psychological aspects of politics, rather than the kind of the dominant economic narrative that had been so much part of the story of European politics, and particularly the kind of conventional left-right divide, social class, arguments about dividing the cake, arguments about state versus market. This had obviously been the staple of politics up until the 1980s, the 1990s. And of course, it remains with us. These things don't just disappear, but they became, to some extent, overshadowed increasingly, particularly in the resistance to the new hegemony, you might say. They came to focus on what seemed to be more cultural and psychological issues, really. And I became interested in the emergence of what one might call the kind of mass elite. I mean, contrary to the kind of tiny elite, the sort of traditional elite that Jens was just talking about in Norway in the 19th century, and I mean, which was, I guess, sort of replicated in England, in Britain, by the kind of landowning aristocratic class that also dominated much of politics and the administration. That in the course of the 20th century, partly thanks to 2 world wars, that elite came to be in some ways replaced by what one might call a mass elite. The old elite often continued. Elites, tend to be very effective at holding on to power and wealth and influence. But if they're sensible elites, they are open to new forces. I mean, this is one of the kind of narratives of modern English / British history, is that, which is why also we avoided, at least since the 1640s, why we avoided a civil war, is that our aristocratic elite was very good at absorbing rising forces of the kind of merchant and commercial classes in the 18th and 19th century, and then indeed the labor movement in the mid-late 19th century. I mean, that's obviously a sort of a traditional sort of social class analysis. By the time we get to the mid 20th century, or the latter part of the 20th century, we start to get new divides along educational lines, and that obviously has some sort of socioeconomic base. I mean, the economy needed, back in the 1970s, 1980s, 1990s, we had the development of the emergence of the knowledge economy. We had the expansion of welfare states. Welfare states, we often forget, have a big demand for professional, cognitive, trained people, whether it's in education, higher education, whether it's in medicine, all the professions related to medicine, in expanding administrations and so on. There was a big demand for more academically trained people. Part of my thesis, I'll come on to this a bit later, part of my thesis in the book that I wrote after The Road to Somewhere, which is called Head, Hand, Heart, The Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century, is about how we've now reached what I call peak head. There isn't any longer the demand for these, for so many cognitively trained young people, which is creating a sort of double whammy, if you like, that we're overproducing an academic mass elite without the demand for their skills. So they're often expecting high status, well-paid professional employment, and they're not finding it. Something like 1/3 of British graduates are not in graduate jobs even 5 to 10 years after graduating. Meanwhile, we have big shortages of what the Germans call Fachkräfte, sort of middle technical occupations, and of course caring jobs. But anyway, I'll come on to that later. I mean, that's the sort of the peak head problem that we've now reached. But for the latter part of the 20th century and moving to the 21st century, almost all of our societies have been dramatically expanding higher education, and we have produced a kind of a new mass elite, which I gave the label anywheres to, meaning people who were educated at least a degree level, were mobile generally, and that's, I mean, I'm sort of betraying my British bias here. I mean, mobility is a particularly important factor in relation to higher education in the UK. I'm not quite sure what the position is in Norway, you can tell me later, but in the UK, something like 75% of all undergraduates go to residential universities. It's the sort of the victory of the kind of Oxbridge, the Oxford and Cambridge public, sort of private boarding school tradition was continued in the when higher education expanded. It expanded very much as a sort of diluted version of traditional elite higher education in places like Oxford and Cambridge, and so if you're a bright working class kid, or you're on the way to university from whatever social class background, you invariably leave your hometown, you leave your parents, you leave the people that you went to school with and grew up with, and you join a different group of people. You don't join a different class, in effect, and that has, I think, underlined a certain set of values what one might call sort of the anywhere worldview. Like I say, mobility, openness, autonomy, a kind of ability to handle change, indeed a very positive outlook on change, a desire for change in some ways, a change and novelty. I mean, this is often, I mean, psychologists say that this is often a characteristics of intelligent people, of highly intelligent people. They tend to be more open to change than people of average or lower intelligence. I mean, some of this is somewhat controversial, but I think it's reasonably well established. So it's sort of, so you have this new mass elite, what I call the kind of the anywheres, emerging particularly powerfully at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century, as a result of the perfectly logical expansion of higher education. Meanwhile, you have this other larger group, the anywheres, by the way, I would say, when I wrote my book, it was only a few years ago, I estimated it at around 25–30% of the population. I mean, that's roughly, if you look at roughly the sort of graduate proportion in the adult population, that is roughly what you come to. The somewheres were, by contrast, less well educated, generally speaking, not people with university degrees. They tend to be more rooted. You know, they weren't people who left at the age of 18 or 19, and they tended to value security and familiarity, traditional ways of doing things. They tended to be less enthusiastic about change. You know, change was often seen as loss, whereas anywheres tended to see change as just inherent in things and therefore good. You know, when you sort of remember all those speeches by sort of Tony Blair about we've got to modernize everything, we've got to change everything. I mean, I think that the key value differences are attitudes to change between anywheres, these groups I label anywheres, in some ways the key differences are attitudes to social change, and I think crucially attitudes to group attachment. And this is where my kind of anywhere somewhere thinking, I think, overlaps with the rather useful idea of the otherwise deathly dull American sociologist, long deceased Tolkien Parsons, you know, the man who tried to produce the sort of encyclopedias of social science. But he did come up with this really useful idea, I think, of looking at human identities on this spectrum, with achieved at one end and ascribed at the other. Now, we all obviously have a mixture of both in our identity, but anywheres tend to have a very high proportion of achieved feelings in their sense of themselves. That sense that they're almost their own creation. They've invented themselves through doing well in exams when they were at school, going to more or less good universities, and having successful professional careers. And it's quite an, I mean, many anywheres are most liberal. Most anywheres, I would say, were kind of broadly speaking liberal in their politics. Many of them are kind of left liberal too, and therefore theoretically sort of hostile to individualism. But the worldview that they tend to develop through their own life experience is actually a very individualistic one. You have these very sort of individualistic leftists who have this sense of of an achieved identity. And the good thing about an achieved identity is that you can sort of, it's very portable. You can kind of take it with you anywhere. You know, hence, you know, if your sense of yourself comes from your own achievements, you're very happy living in the edgy inner city. You're very happy living in Tower Hamlets, you know, surrounded by people from a completely different culture to you, maybe speak a different language to you. because you have this sense of your achieved identity. Whereas if you come from the majority somewhere group, your sense of yourself often comes from your place, from your group, the people that you grew up with, the people that you kind of recognize as similar to you in many ways. This doesn't have to be a xenophobic thing. It can sometimes tip over into a hostility to others and outsiders. But it's just it's just who you are. You're a Geordie from Newcastle, who works in a factory, has a certain way of life and a group identity that comes from your place, your networks, that means that this is the crucial point I think about somewheres, is that their identities are much more susceptible to being disrupted by change. If your sense of yourself comes from your place and group, and your place and indeed group changes, if suddenly your neighborhood fills up with people who are different to you, it could be gentrification. Suddenly it's full of middle class and upper class people, or it's people from it's immigrants from abroad, or people from even a different part of your own country. That can be quite disturbing to you. You don't have the sort of identity protection that an achieved identity provides you. So yeah, that was just to recap my Anywhere Somewhere idea. Some of you will be familiar with it already. A few of the criticisms that were made of it, one of them was that this was far too binary, and it is if you just think of Anywheres and Somewheres. Obviously, like any binary, that is too simplistic. And I did write in the book about how many different kinds of Anywheres there are, how many different kinds of Somewheres there are too. These are big fuzzy categories. Like I say, they do. I invented the labels. I didn't invent the worldviews. I spent a lot of time with my nose in opinion and value surveys, particularly the British Social Attitude Surveys, which are very helpful. They go back to the early 80s, so you can sort of see the development of many of this divergent worldview, this divergent Anywhere Somewhere worldview. Now, of course, as I say, there are lots of different kinds of Anywheres and lots of different kinds of Somewheres. There's also a big group I call the in-betweeners, for want of a better phrase, who sort of share almost equally aspects of the Somewhere and Anywhere worldview, and they make up about 20-25% of the population. Anywheres 25% or so, Somewheres around 50%. Now, one can argue about these precise proportions, and they shift around a bit, depends what the issue is, what the subject you're talking about is. Like I say, I didn't invent these worldview divides that have emerged, strongly at the end of the 20th century. I think it takes different forms, obviously, in different countries. And obviously takes a distinct form in Norway. And I'm writing mainly about Britain, but I think many of the reason I'm here today is because obviously these ideas have a purchase in other similar countries too. One thing I would really emphasize, because obviously a lot of liberal-minded people were put rather on the defensive by my analysis. A lot of people, Guardian journalists like Jonathan Friedland were saying, but well, I do have kind of Anywhere ideas, but I'm very, very rooted in Stoke Newington or wherever it is in London that people like Jonathan live. And of course, I don't deny that. You can be a rooted Anywhere up to a point, although most people who live in Stoke Newington don't come from Stoke Newington. These are often places that people have congregated in precisely because the people who live there tend to share a certain set of values. So these are sort of value clusters rather than places of origin generally. But of course, the important point is that both of these worldviews are completely legitimate. I mean, one of the I think the criticisms that I mean, a lot of people felt attacked by the categorizations, and they I mean, they weren't really meant to feel that. But I think it is true that yeah, I mean, look, but both of these worldviews, are, at least in their mainstream form, are decent and legitimate. I mean, the problem is they conflict in all sorts of points, and hence have created these changes to our politics, you know, often quite radical changes in the form of things like Brexit and Trump, that have suddenly sort of, you know, emerged from underground, as it were. But I think the reason why there is a problem, and the reason why the tone of my book was seen perhaps as an attack, okay, on the kind of more liberal-minded anywhere class, is because anywheres have become too dominant in democratic societies. You need political legitimacy from, you know, large proportions of the population, and I think what had happened was that imperceptibly over a period of 20 or 30 years, particularly from that kind of opening up period with the end of the Cold War in the early 90s, you had you know, the gradual emergence of a sort of hegemonic anywhere political worldview in many of our countries, which included aspects of the left and the right. Whoever was in power, you had broadly the same policies, whether it was promotion of higher education, and certainly in the UK, and not necessarily everywhere, but certainly in the UK, the neglect of technical education, apprenticeships, and so on. So those people, a neglect of the people who weren't going to college. You know, you had this, you know, Tony Blair made a famous speech in 1999 saying 50% of all school leavers must go to university, without giving any, I thought it was extremely emotionally unintelligent, no thought given to how different it is for people who don't go to college, when only 10 or 15% of their schoolmates or people who live in their town go on to university and they don't. It doesn't matter if only 10 or 15%. When 50% go to college and you don't, it's a completely different psychological ballgame, and you might well then sort of, you're starting life kind of on the back foot, because and this is the subject of my most recent book, Head, Hand, Heart. So much, you know, that cognitive ability has become the kind of gold standard of human esteem in our societies, which I think is a real problem. I know I've got to stop in a moment, but I mean, this whole question of anywhere domination. I mean, as I say, anywheres have tended to promote, you know, things like the knowledge economy, higher education. There's tended to be a sort of, in family and gender policy, a bias against domesticity, a kind of a very strong attachment to a certain kind of social mobility. You know, ladders up. You know, let's save the clever ones from the lower social classes. I mean, this is obviously, that's a caricature, but I mean, that is kind of what's going on. And a lot of these things that were shared between centre right and centre left. But, you know, many of these things were quite good things. I mean, you know, this is the period when we had a great liberalisation in attitudes to race and gender and homosexuality and so on and so forth. So I'm not saying these things were all negative by any means, but I do think my final point, I think that anywhere domination has underlined the three weaknesses, what you might call the sort of social psychological weaknesses of contemporary liberalism in Europe and North America. One is the attitude to change. It's two, and this has a kind of, you might say, a sort of right-wing and a left-wing version. The right-wing version is being too eager to embrace the creative destruction of modern capitalism, being, you know, say in the case of the UK, the dramatic deindustrialization that happened over very short periods of time in the 70s and 80s, in the case of the left, being too eager to embrace change is symbolized by mass immigration. So you have attitudes to change, you have an anywhere attitude to change imposed on populations who often are discomforted by it. The second thing is my point about too much emphasis on just one form of human ability, the academic cognitive ability, and the declining status of so much non-graduate employment. The final point is about domesticity, which I mentioned briefly earlier. I think this is, that modern feminism and modern anywhere liberalism have sort of allied themselves in a sort of downgrading of the value of family life and domesticity, which many people, including many women, a majority of women, are often uncomfortable with. Feminism has defined itself too much against care. Certainly, I think in the UK and the US, which I know best. I think so. Those.
Sorry, David, but okay. I think we have to stop there.
Yeah, fair enough.
You can delve somewhat deeper into these issues later on. It was extremely stimulating to listen to you and have a recap of all these important points and get some very interesting perspectives. And now we are going to get the voice from the periphery, but it is an academic elitist who is going to, an academic elite person who is going to share that with us, namely Professor Reidar Almås at the NTNU, Norwegian Technological University. So please, Reidar, you have the floor.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Sorry, Reidar. Bare et kjapt hvis du går på visningsinnstillinger på toppen der, ser du det øverst til venstre der? Der, klikk der, og så tar du bytt mellom presentasjonsvisning og lysbildefremvisning. Sånn, supert.
Takk. Ja, jeg skal ta tilbake til Norge og forhåpentligvis ende opp med å se hva vi kan lære av Davids distinksjon. Vi ga I fjor ut boka Distriktsopprør. I changed to English, The Uprising from the Periphery, or The Periphery Strikes Back, which is my title today. I think the name of the book in English could be The Periphery Strikes Back as well. That was edited by Eirik Magnus Fuglestad and me, and has drawn a lot of discussion afterwards. I take some points out of that book for this lecture, and the main question we asked was, is this a new cleavage between center and periphery? Is this a new political development we see in Norway now? It's like a Norwegian version of yellow vests and Brexit and Trumpism, or is it a revival of the old opposition between the center and periphery, which Jens described at the start of this seminar, between city and countryside in Norwegian politics, or is it both? And I start with my conclusion. The present uprising from the periphery is definitely a revival of old cleavages between center and periphery, not only between urban and rural areas, but between the rural mid-Norway and the inland, the countercultural West Norway and the coastal North on the one side, and the elites, especially the Oslo elites, the rural, most prestigious elites on the other side. I draw this from Stein Rokkan, the Norwegian well-known political scientist who in 1987 published this double triangle scheme On the top, you have the center, and bottom, the peripheries, and to the left, the economic triangle, and to the right, the cultural triangle. And if you look at the left, the economic triangle, you have on top the capital interest to the upper left, and down the primary producers' interest, and opposing the capital interest, you have the working class interest. And on the other side, that was also mentioned by David, and it's I agree that you also in Norway see that it's not going away, this triangle. It's always there, but it has been kind of removed from the top cleavage discussions to the right triangle. It is the cultural triangle. On top you have the central urban cultural radicalism, which nowadays is represented by the Anniverse. And then you have the two other, on the bottom you have the defense of rural cultures, and in the middle you have the defense of religious identity. And these are represented by, I think we can call it cultural lags, that it's, for instance, the defense of rural cultures, it's stronger than the 10% writing the new Norwegian language, which in the 100 years ago and more was defining the rural cultures, but it's a more broader group that of course also have sympathizers in the urban area. So we have like three peripheries in Norway. The more egalitarian southwestern coastal periphery with the background in the Christianity movement, the lay movement, represented by the Christian People's Party, emerged in the 30s. Then the more class-divided northern periphery, the coastal periphery, with the basis in the fishing and fishing industries, between the opposition between the fish buyers and those who sell fish and sell labor, expressed by Labour Party's early breakthrough in the early 1900s. And then you have the more self-sustained agriculture-oriented inland periphery, expressed by the emergence of the peasant parties in the 20s. So what is the new district uprising in Norway? What is the reason for this last 5-10 years districts uprising? I think the most important factor is the municipal and regional amalgamation reform that was started by the present center-right government of Solberg. But there are also a lot of other reforms that drew opposition, like the police reforms, taking down the local police stations and putting the police on wheels, as it was said. Also closing of defense facilities in the north, lacking of maternity and ambulance services in the rural areas, centralization of this to larger hospitals in the cities, closing of local hospitals, and lack of public transport was one reason. Building of new power plants is quite recent, been opposed by rural and also urban people, and there is an opposition against expensive ferry and ship traffic. And the last point on the list is the farmers' uprising we have seen this spring against the farm policy. So What do they have in common, these uprisings? It's an anger over centralization of workplaces and services, and a feeling of lack of powerlessness. So, as I see it, the center-periphery dimension has got out of the political twilight. In Norwegian history, the small settlements, towns and districts, they have always had to stand up to fight for their interests. The cities do not have the same reason to fight politically, because in many ways the market is doing the work for the big cities. Examples here are labor market, housing market, recruitment to public and public committees and councils. Let's say the labor market, if you own your own dwelling, your own where you live in towns, the prices are rising, and also the capital you have in your house in the rural areas. When you move into a newly built house, the value is down to half because of the housing market is very slow in the rural areas. And the balance between city and periphery has in the recent years tipped in favor of the cities, especially the big cities during the decade of globalization since the early 90s. And it has passed a tipping point, I think. If you look at the old kind of balance in Norwegian politics represented by the Labour Party, it was, the slogan said, city and land hand in hand. What we see now is very much similar to the district uprising in other countries like Britain and the US. There is also an experience in Norwegian politics that such rights, such political rights can only be won if they are carved into practical politics by political coalitions that gain power. If it doesn't happen, the districts uprising will be a blow in the air, and they will end in defeat, the frustration, and ultimately, who knows? There are a sign now, and recent research also show from Norse and the Department of Social Research that there is a decline in confidence for politicians. There's a general decline between 2011 and 2019, both for all politicians, but also for more decline for confidence for national politicians than for local politicians. If we look at different social groups and different size of the communities, you see that the decline in confidence is most, for national politicians, is most outspoken in areas with less than 2,500 inhabitants, small communities. In small communities, the confidence for national politicians has declined most. In larger municipalities, there is more trust to national politicians, and in the small municipalities, they have more trust to their own politicians, the municipal council politicians, than in larger municipalities. And if we, in one word, one sentence, can put the nail on it, it's the rural-urban relations, they may be breached, and we have a strong tradition for that in Norway, symbolized with the social democratic slogan, city and land hand in hand. and they may be broken. And what we see now is that they are more broken than bridged. And we have a tradition in Norway that the rural rural uprisings, they succeed. Like in the 30s, the Rural People's Crisis Help, they protested against unemployment and financial crisis for small businesses, and they lost. The movement lost, but the issue won when the Labour Party and the Peasant Party got the crisis agreement in 1935, and we got our first social democratic government. The rural people also won in 1972 in the fight against membership of the common market, and also again in 1994. And in 1975, a farmers' tax strike resulted in a subsequent parliamentary decision to equate farmers' income with average industrial worker incomes in 6 years. I think the Norwegian strength is that we have a strong sector in public sector in rural areas, and also in urban areas, of course. There is given priority in politics in many parties to primary resource industries. We have a strong civil society tradition and a living modernized rural culture. A lot of people in my area here, they have a higher education and they commute to town. And there is a political competition now. Who has got the best rural and regional policies? And small towns and rural regions, they have a strong political voice, the Center Party, the party that claim that they are close to people. It's the former Farmers Party, but it's much wider now socially and than the farmers. And we have seen a great political upheaval during the last 6 years. The Center Party with their leader Trygve Slagsvold Vedum has risen from 5 to 17% on the polls, while the Labour Party, the Social Democrats with Jonas Gahr Støre in the leadership, has lost from 35 down to 24%. And why is that? I think there are several explanations. Leadership and identity is one. Støre is a rich man. It's not his fault. He has inherited his fortunes, but that is used against him on the grassroots. Slagsvold Vedum, on the other side, he has a coffee cup strategy. His talks is very good at small talk with people where they are. It has also been a Me Too scandal for the deputy leader Trond Giske that has contributed to this upheaval. And also the centralizing reforms. The Center Party has been against all the time, while the Social Democrats, they were in favor of some of the reforms and just lately becoming against the most unpopular of them. So in short, we can say that the Social Democratic clothes, they were stolen. First, they were left by the Stoltenberg regime in 2000 to 2001, especially the role of the state in economy and the strong public sector was kind of downgraded by the Social Democrats, and those clothes were stolen by the Center Party. How can David Goodhart's concept somewheres and anywheres explain the Labour Party decline? I think the key example might be Jan Bøhler, who left the Labour Party last fall. The first reason was that he would likely lose his place in Parliament after the 2021 election. He wouldn't get high place on on the list. He would be replaced by an anywhere, who knows who. Jan Bøhler is a urban somewhere with roots from the Grorud Valley in East Oslo. He's a traditional social democrat, strong on values like do your duty and demand your right. And his opponents in Oslo they are typically anywheres with high education and strong views on identity politics. On the other side, he is also good at small talk, this Jan Bøhler, in grassroots campaigning, and is a spokesperson for the periphery areas in Oslo with rising inequality and increasing crime. He's also talking people's language like Vedum, and gives priority to meet people rather than meeting in party meetings. These people who maybe replace him on the social democratic list, they are typically anywheres with high education. And while Bøhler is fighting for, together with the Center Party, for local hospitals and people's right to drive fossil cars, for instance, to just take two examples. And he said in a recent interview that after 16 years in parliament, I have received so much backing. I've had a new spring, says Jan Bøhler, and now recently fighting for the Ullevål Hospital and the Norwegian broadcasting to the Grorud Valley, where is more peripheral valley in Oslo region. And he is also fighting against climate politics harming those with ordinary incomes and demand public services where people live, like police and maternity wards, hospitals. So, do we have a perfect storm? I think so. There's a lack of a lot of factors like the centralizing reforms I started with, the internal conflicts in the Labour Party. That is the old industrial leaders versus young identity politicians. On the other side, there is an internal calm in the Center Party after some conflicts there too. And I mentioned the Me Too scandals, one main scandal that forced the deputy leader Trond Giske to resign. And on top of that, we have a difference in leadership style. Gahr Støre is an anywhere, and you might say a Labour outsider, and definitely an anywhere with the education, French education, higher education from the elite universities there, speaking French. That could be good for a Norwegian prime minister, but I don't think it's drawing any votes on the grassroots. And Slagsvold Vedum is a somewhere and rural insider, and is flying high on that. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Reidar. I think it's for this very good analysis and introduction to Norwegian politics and the conflict between center and periphery. We should explain to David why the Center Party is actually the periphery party. It's because it's in the political center, but it also reflects the fact, perhaps, as Reidar showed, that historically the periphery in Norway is often victorious. So the periphery is the real empire that can strike back, and which is doing it again. So now we'll give the floor to Dag Einar, who will tell us about how the what is behind the demise of the decline of the Norwegian Labour Party, which is not so serious as other Labour parties, though, and they have allied themselves now with the Centre Party. So, but nevertheless, it has declined very much in voting adherence. So please, Dag Einar, who is my colleague at USN.
Thank you.
In political science.
Yes, I'll try to be relatively brief, but it's quite a lot to say, and some of the things I was going to say has already been said. So let's just get it started. And now we'll need the that way, always a bit of a, like so, and then this one. Now it seems to work. Perfect. Yes, we've already, well, this is an illustration from the election campaign of 1936. It is quite interesting because it says something about the Norwegian Labour Party as it was in the years immediately preceding the Second World War. We've already talked about, well, town and country hand in hand, but the bottom slogan is perhaps even more interesting, namely Norway for the people. The Norwegian Labour Party was, a very long time ago, a populist party, in the sense of Müller, Modde, all the others who have talked about populism in recent years, not when it comes to anti-immigration and that sort of thing, because that were not salient issues in those times, but populist in the sense that one viewed Norway divided between the people and the elite, the tiny elite who ruled everything, and it was Labour's mission in life to overturn elite domination, make sure that the people, the vast majority of the population, had a say, had a place around the table, had a seat in government. So the Norwegian Labour Party has clearly populist roots. And I'm using that term in a neutral sense of the word, not as a code word for everything I think is horrible and evil in the world, as some people tend to do, but rather as a term for politicians, political movements, political parties who believe that they are representatives of the people as opposed to the elites. Now, the big picture when it comes to labor in Norway is, as Kai mentioned, a relatively mild spring breeze compared to what has happened to other social democratic parties in many European countries. For instance, the Social Democrats in the Netherlands and France, and perhaps most famously in Greece, collapsed altogether. The Social Democrats in Greece went from close to 45% in one election to fewer than 5% of the votes in the next election. So a total collapse. The French Socialist Party lost in the 2017 election. They lost 90% of their seats in the National Assembly. They lost the president and they lost the majority in the Senate, and hasn't really returned either of them. The Partij van de Arbeid in the Netherlands have returned somewhat, but is still no longer the second largest party as they used to be, more like the third or fourth largest party. And compared to those examples, Labour in Norway has not collapsed. They're more undergone sort of slow decline, but the suggestion at the opinion polls at the moment is that Labour is heading for its worst election defeat in over 70 years. Worst election result in over 90 years, actually. And they will still, in all likelihood, be the party for the next prime minister. It was a sort of a paradoxical situation for Labour at the national level, where one will have the next prime minister, but still experience its worst election defeat in close to a century. Now, Rokkan has already been mentioned, the sort of founding figure of Norwegian political science, or the one who brought post-war American political science to Norway. He was famous for his cluttered offices, and this is a picture of him where he has obviously cleaned his office a lot in honor of the photographer. And as you can see from the window with the mountains in the background, this is from his Bergen office and not from his office at Yale University. But that being said, he has, in his studies of Norwegian electoral politics and political behavior, he identified two very distinct peripheries. One was what he called the countercultural periphery, which may be considered a bit of a misnomer, because we're not talking about a liberal radical sort of counterculture here. We are talking more about non-conformist, low church, religious conservative periphery, primarily but not exclusively in the south and west of Norway. There are pockets of countercultural periphery both in the north of Norway and in the easternmost parts of Norway, close to the border with Sweden. But those are isolated pockets of countercultural periphery. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is not that, and perhaps the most famous of Rokkan's two peripheries, but the other periphery, namely what Rokkan called the class polarized periphery. That was basically the rest of Norway outside of the Oslo area, and perhaps also some of the other bigger cities and towns. The most of north of Norway, the middle of Norway, and the eastern parts of Norway were part of what Rokkan described as a class polarized periphery. And in this class polarized periphery, Labour was in many municipalities the majority, the supermajority party. It was a catch-all party that attracted a lot of voters in these areas that might not have belonged to Labour in other parts of the country. That is that whenever a party is strong, you tend to see a gravitational move towards that party by people interested in a political career, people that want to not to stand out in the crowd, people who want to vote and say the same things as their neighbors and so forth. So you get almost up until the present day, areas of Norway where Labour had a majority or was close to a majority in several dozen municipalities, all characterized by being part of what Rokan called the class polarized periphery. Now I seem to have lost my clock, so I'll just take the other one there. Now this is a slightly smaller example. My colleague and previous speaker was describing what had happened to the Center Party. And this is one example of what we might call a creeping or creeping realignment of the electoral landscape in parts of Norway. This is from what I consider to be one of the more interesting examples, namely the Sauda municipality in Rogaland in the southwestern part of Norway. It is part of the class polarized periphery and not as that much part of the countercultural periphery, even if it is surrounded by areas that are part of the countercultural or religious conservative periphery. Sauda itself is an industrial town. It has for over a century been centered on metallurgical industry. It is a fairly large municipality, but most of it is not agricultural areas, more like mountains and areas for quite extensive as opposed to intensive farming. And most of the people in Sauda live in the central settlement, and there are very few farmers in the municipality who receive subsidies, which is sort of the cutoff point for when you go from being an horticulturalist to becoming a professional farmer. For instance, I have in my backyard 100 square feet of potatoes, but that doesn't make me a farmer. And there are actually fewer farmers receiving subsidies in Sauda than in Stavanger, one of the bigger cities across the fjord from Sauda. And it is essentially a town with a few mountains around it and not that many farmers, not a strong agricultural sector. So it has traditionally been a community based around industry, and there has been a high degree of class polarization because of this. But then in recent years, we see in this town without farmers that the Farmers' Party becomes a supermajority party in the last local elections, receiving more than 50% of the votes. And only 8 years before, less than 10% of the vote. So this is what we in the political science dialect calls a realignment of the electorate. And it shows that the agrarian center party has now become something more than a party for people with a strong association with agriculture. It has become a catch-all party for the periphery, even in this class polarized periphery, which should have been one of Labour's strongholds, and indeed was one of Labour's strongholds until 2011. So it has happened quite recently, a dramatic shift in electoral politics in this municipality, and there are several other examples of the same playing out a little bit differently in different communities, but nevertheless we see that Labour has lost its grip on what ought to have been its definitive strongholds. Now, Sauda is an extreme example, and it is merely one of many examples of this electoral realignment. My colleague and previous speaker talked about how the Centre Party had moved from being a party only 7 years ago, a party around 4 or 5% of the electorate behind it, to now being a party of 17, 18, perhaps even 20%. And it has gone in the same time from being a party for people associated with agriculture to becoming a catch-all party for the periphery. And at the same time, Labour has declined in many municipalities and communities all across Norway. Some places like Sauda, it's been a dramatic realignment. Other places a slower movement, and then there's the third group, which is perhaps even more interesting. That is those places where Labour seemed to hold on to its position of a supermajority party. For instance, here in Træna, in Nordland County, where Labour still has 67.1% of the vote, but of course, when the total number of voters is less than 300, and it really doesn't matter that much in the national results, but it probably goes to show that what happens at the local level is often dependent on what individuals do or say. A local politician from one party might be able to save his or her own party from destruction. Another individual in another community might be able to make a less than 10% party into a more than 50% party in the span of just 2 elections. It really, in many instances, has a lot to do with what individuals do when we talk about municipalities and communities with a few hundred or a few thousand voters. Now, there is, however, and there can really be no doubt about it, that the Norwegian Labour Party has seen a slow slump in electoral support over the last 40 years or so, and that this decline has been at its strongest in their former strongholds in the class polarized periphery. Now, what explains this decline? Now, one premise is that what has happened to Labour in Norway is part of a broader European trend of waning support for Social Democrats, which means that an explanation of Labour's decline only focusing on local factors must be lacking in some sense or another, because if there was only a local explanation to Labour's decline in Norway, one wouldn't expect to see the same movement in several European countries in roughly the same time period. So that is why a more complete explanation must take into account those variations which appear concurrently in both Norway and other European countries in which the Social Democrats have seen a slump in at the polls. So my suggestion is that the main explanation for this decline is what has been called the professionalization of politics. And why has that hurt Social Democrats more than others? It is because it has happened at the same time as Social Democrats have gone from being populist to being anti-populist, in a sense. And I'm just looking at my watch here. Right. The Social Democrats of Europe today are basically not only non-populists, they are anti-populist. It's part of the DNA of the ruling elites within social democratic parties all across Europe, that they are anti-populist. This is a radical break from the tradition of social democratic parties all across Europe. Social Democrats used to be populist in the sense that they said and professed wanting to fight for the people against some or another elite, and now they are anti-populist. And this is perhaps also the start of an explanation for why Social Democrats all across Europe seem to decline most in terms of electoral support in the periphery, in the areas which used to be their strongholds. You see much of the same thing in the north of England, in the industrial areas of France and Germany. It is where they were at their strongest that Social Democrats have lost the most. Now, I'll still run this through quite rapidly. Mr. Goodhart talked about New Labour briefly earlier on, and New Labour had its run-in with Norway as well, in the sense that neoliberal ideas crept into the credo of social democratic leaders at around the same time, at around the turn of the century. And in Norway, it severely weakened ties between the party organization and many of its longtime supporters, especially in the periphery. And after the turn of the century, these ties have been further weakened between labor and the traditional working class, both in the primary sector and in heavy industry, because of the onslaught of, with broad terms, one might call identity politics, environmentalism, urbane liberality, and it seems that the political elites both in the Norwegian Labour Party and in several of the other social democratic parties of Europe, this move towards what I have called urban liberality is further weakening the ties between Labour parties and their traditional supporters. Now, this is my last picture. This is a sum up where I try to connect this with the somewheres, anywheres distinction, which is a distinction which is quite useful in the sense that it downplays the geographical dimension and underlines the sociological dimension of what we are talking about here. As Labour has become this urbane, anywhere, big city, higher education party, it has seen a dramatic, in the longer run, a quite dramatic decline of electoral support. And at the same time, Labour finds itself in stiff competition from new left Green parties, also vying for the same voters. So what is left here is a picture where Labour doesn't want their old supporters anymore. They want someone new. They want someone living in big cities, having higher education and so forth. And that leaves their old voters homeless and ready to be scooped up by other parties. Thankfully in Norway by a center-left agrarian party and not by right-wing populists as in other European countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dag. You have shown us how the Labour Party went from trying to somewheres and going to, over to trying to appeal to anywheres, and they risk ending up being nowheres, so to speak. But we are not yet there completely. But we will now have an open debate, and we have a few questions. But the questions they are not so numerous. So I think it would be a good idea to ask the people who have questions to put them orally. What do you think, Jens? Should we start with the first question by Camilla Nereid?
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think
if the technician can open her microphone, give her access, and she can open it herself. She has a question about immigrants, which has to do with what are their status, because they can't be somewheres in the sense of belonging to where they came from, but not completely. But at the same time, they tend to cling to it. Perhaps Camilla can give her question or ask her question personally.
I think she should be able to talk now.
Okay, can you hear me? Which is
yes,
yes, we
the
hear
most
you.
common asked questions the last year, I think. Yes, so this is for Goodhart. I think it was very interesting to listen to you and the other speakers. So I have two questions, because if you could just elaborate a little bit about the immigrant issues, because the immigrants can surely be divided in two groups. Also, they are somewheres forced to become anywheres in a way, and maybe becoming nowheres, while some of them are anywheres and moving to somewhere else. It's easy to get trapped in this wordplay because it's so funny. And also, I think now we have heard a lot of interesting comments about the situation in Norway. And I used to work in a municipality before I started working at the university. And this wish for the rural Norway and the small municipalities to still have a future, to me seems quite impossible, because even though we have a high percentage of young people in Norway with higher education, and especially women, they are supposed to have this anywhere attitude, but they don't. They have a somewhere attitude, and the place where they want to be is in the big city. They don't want to be anywhere. They want to be somewhere, and the somewhere is in the city. So this attitude, at least in the Norwegian education system, that they can be anywhere, doesn't seem to function like that here in Norway. So if you could just comment on this, I would be very happy. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Camilla. Then we leave the floor to David Goodhart to comment on that, please.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, where immigrants fit into this model. Yeah, they do, as you say, they tend to have a combination of somewhere and anywhere, well, attitudes and values. I mean, they're often immigrants, particularly relatively recent immigrants, first, second generation immigrants, are often amongst the most rooted people in certainly in countries like the UK. They, for all sorts of different reasons, tend to cluster together in certain. I mean, like Tower Hamlets, parts of East London are very Bangladeshi. People want to, you know, even when, as it were, the threat from the majority population is much reduced, if not essentially disappeared altogether, in the way that attitudes to race and otherness have liberalized a great deal in most of our societies. But even so, there is a logic for minority groups to cluster together. There are often cultural factors, you know, being close to a mosque or halal shops and so on and so forth if you're Muslim. So that produces a very high degree of rootedness often for immigrants, and yet often, of course, they're also more than the majority population. They're often connected to, sort of internationally connected elsewhere to different cultures and different politics, and you know, many of those Bangladeshis I mentioned will watch Bengali language television stations. They will often know more about the politics of Bangladesh than they do about the politics of Britain. So they kind of have a foot in both camps often, certainly in the sort of first 2 or 3 generations, I would say. It's interesting what you say too about higher education. I mean, I think the UK, Britain is a little bit unusual in having such a high degree of people who leave to go to university, the boarding university. I think in most European countries, often in the most elite universities you get, I mean, like in, you know, sort of Harvard and Yale in America, the what are they called, the higher university sector in France, what's it called? I can't remember. They quite often are residential, but I mean, most people in Germany, and perhaps this is true in Norway too, go to university in their hometown. It's a sort of extension of secondary school. And I mean, I think you have a very high participation rate in higher education in Norway, but I think the definition of higher education is often very fuzzy. Often people essentially mean any form of sort of post-school education. It can cover a whole host of different things, from very vocational, technical education to very elite academic education. So you do, yeah. I mean, I think that is quite a good example of where you know, anywheres can also have somewhere impulses. Obviously, everybody belongs somewhere, even if it's not the place that they originally come from. This was I think the slightly artificial complaint that somebody like Jonathan Friedland at The Guardian made about the book. I mean, these are very broad and sort of fuzzy distinctions, but I still think there is, I mean, people who are highly educated do tend to be inducted into a worldview that is much more open to change, much more open to the kind of the unfamiliar, the novel, and that's obviously not a bad thing, but it's and obviously those same people often have quite sort of somewhere-ish feelings about their attachment to their vibrant inner city area, say. This is not exactly a contradiction, because, as I say, everybody wants to belong somewhere, but there are different, I suppose it's a matter of thinking in terms of different forms of belonging. I mean, there is the belonging to the place that you originally came from and that you've never left, or left only, moved only a few miles, and the place that you've adopted as your sort of rooted, safe space, as it were. So I don't think, these are sort of caveats. These are reasonable caveats, I think, to the thesis.
Yeah, thank you very much, because the NUers, they can choose their somewhere in a way when the somewheres are. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I think it would be interesting to have a small comment also from Reidar Almås on this last question about especially women don't wanting to go back to the periphery after having tasted the enticing aspects of urban life in Oslo or Bergen or somewhere, because it's above all, or very much a problem with women, because then there is no reproduction comes to a halt in the periphery because of the lack of educated women and working places for educated women. Would you like to comment on that briefly, Reidar, before then there's another question for you afterwards?
I could start with the striking change that over the last 20 years, the social group wanting higher education has moved from the cities to the countryside, like the northwest of Norway, women in northwest Norway. I think about 70% of them finish the gymnas videregående, the college in Norway, while in East Oslo, I think it's down to 20% among boys. And that is an illustration of how women now demand jobs in with higher education. And in the rural areas, it can be in education or in hospitals, in healthcare. It's very few jobs, and the jobs are in the city. So I don't think it's because women particularly want to live in cities. They want to have jobs. And that is a very strong driving force in centralization. When it comes to education, I can move to the question by Torvald Gran, who asked me about the populist attitude to research and education, and also towards immigration and nationalism. I think we have forgotten today to speak about the other, at least the first populist party in Norway in the 1980s, 1990s. That was the Progress Party. That has been in government now for 6 years. They are out now in the government with the Conservatives, and they are typically representative of populists with anti-immigration, anti-research also, I would say, and anti-elite attitudes. But when they got into government themselves, they ruled as they had never done anything other than that. So they lost about 2/3 or about half of the electorate. The center party is very different. They are positive to education. They are positive to research. That's from their farmer party background. And they are also not especially nationalists, as you put it, Torvald Gran. They are, of course, they are in favor of putting Norway first, but there is, because of the treaties Norway has gone into, like the European Economic Trade Area treatment and also the WHO treatment, there is a very limited how much they can give priority to Norwegian interests and Norwegian farmers and Norwegian industries. So I think in the first place, it was the Progress Party who stole the political clothes of labor in the north and in the west. But that has changed now. And I think the Center Party might be much more successful because they also aligned, as has been mentioned, and they will with the Labour Party, and they will likely form a government together with the Labour Party, with the Labour Party Prime Minister. I agree with that. It's a paradox that the Labour Party, when they have declined down to 20–25%, they will have both the Prime Minister and they will get into government in the fall, and then start a very interesting period in Norwegian politics. That this plate change will materialize itself, and who is going to deliver to the voters. It's one thing to compete for voters. It's definitely another thing to produce reforms and produce politics that their voters will like.
Okay, thank you. We are a bit certain whether everybody saw the question that you answered now.
I answered the question that no one, only one man.
We got the answer first, and then we'll have the question afterwards. And that is.
But Kai.
Yes.
Shall we maybe give the word a little bit to Torvald Gran?
Yes, Torvald can sum up his question.
Yeah.
Which was about global knowledge, and which is the only thing that can solve our problems. So please, Torvald, sum up your comment, and you can comment on that answer.
Torvald, now you should be able to talk. But you have to unmute yourself.
Unmute. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, now we hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes, just to follow up, since Reidar already has tried to answer my question, I think I could formulate it more sharply, perhaps. Is it correct to, or do you still pose the relation between rural and urban, or between center and periphery, as separate, as an absolute separation, with sort of different identities and cultures on both sides? Or, and my question is whether this is a correct position, in the sense that the understanding of local power and decentralization is exactly, or can be, a function of engagement in global processes, in global knowledge production, etc., and global production processes, so that we actually are seeing now a common identity between rural and urban areas, especially among young and middle-aged people, perhaps. And lastly, that this progressive party, or the both right-wing and left-wing sort of nationalist identity with exclusive nationalism as a break towards or a threat towards this common development.
Thank you. I think like anywheres and somewheres, rural and urban, they are fuzzy concepts. Although you can find a rural area in the landscape and a city in the landscape, I think they overlap. And we also see urbanization of rural areas in many countries, at least in Norway. The underlying contradiction here is the contradiction between those who are harmed by globalization and those who profit, I think, and also by the marital class and the uneducated classes. Because my neighbor is a farmer and he's struggling. I have been a researcher, and all my time I've seen success around me. People are getting jobs, they getting better paid. We have established a big research groups. I've nothing to fear from globalization. I think we have profited from globalization. Second neighbor is an electrician. He's competing with foreign labor from Poland and Lithuania, some of them illegal. And I think the lack of being able to mitigate globalization is the biggest fault of the Social Democratic Party and all politicians, I think, because there has been a long tradition in the Norwegian Labour Party to mitigate, to give something to people that lose out. And they have been quite successful at doing reforms, like take education. They established the districts high schools, as we call them, the regional colleges all over the country. And as you know from the last program of the Labour Party, that they kind of try to repeat that success, meeting not least the women in the rural areas, in the rural areas who don't want to move, who are somewheres, that don't want to be anywhere. They can't because they have children and they have other obligations in the family. So I think there is not a contradiction between the what you call the knowledge society and I'm not a advisor of the Labour Party, but what you can call a modernist Labour policy to mitigate and to meet the needs of those harmed by globalization. It's not in Norway. It's a bit too late because they got a competitor. The first competitor, I think, lost because they partly because the Progress Party, they was very anti-immigrant and very old-fashioned in many ways. But I think the Center Party has put up competition against the Norwegian Labour that in many ways is very, very good for people in all Norway, because those who have lost out, they can have a voice and they can vote for someone that take their problems seriously.
Thank you very much, Reidar. We have only a few minutes left now. I think it would be nice to leave the floor to our main guest, David, and perhaps you could comment on this somewhat cosmopolitan aspect, which perhaps unites somewheres and anywheres, which is the global challenges which affects us all, so to speak, the adverse side of globalization for all of us. How do we deal with that in a way that can appeal to both somewheres and anywheres? Because even though Reidar now said that the Center Party, they are not against knowledge, but they are for fossil cars, there are certain conflict dimensions also. So perhaps you could comment on this aspect, both in Britain and perhaps about some of what you've heard in about Norway, please.
Yeah, no, well, it's interesting to see these patterns replicated in Norway. I mean, the story seems to be largely one of your main centre-left party becoming essentially a liberal graduate party, which is what centre-left parties all over Europe have become over the last 20 or 30 years, representing obviously an important and growing constituency, but not the original constituency. And the alliance, as it were, between the kind of liberal graduate element that used to be quite small and the lower income working class element that used to be quite large, that alliance has fractured. And I think that's partly because politics has become much more focused on cultural issues. If anything, there's been a convergence on economic ideas. I mean, we're all kind of market-friendly social democrats these days. And there's a saying, I can't remember, I think it may have been me that invented it, or maybe Matt Goodwin. we argue about who first came up with the idea that it's one of the reasons why you see this sort of shift, not necessarily to the right. I mean, as you were saying, I mean, the Progress Party has weakened. Classical or the more extreme forms of populism haven't flourished everywhere, but nonetheless, the sort of realignment that we saw in the 29 election in Britain that Dag mentioned, the fall of the Red Wall to the Tories and so on, all of that can be understood, I think, through the adage that it's easier for the right to move to the left on economics than it is for the left to move to the right on culture. And as parties of the centre-left become deeper and deeper involved in identity politics, and I mean your hilarious little picture of the kind of advance of humanity to the 2019 Gay Pride March, I think rather sort of summed up the difficulty for parties of the centre-left, and because polarization is a great deal stronger in cultural matters than it is in economic matters now. Even though you might say that the centre-left, the liberal graduate class, represents the future in some ways, and but it doesn't yet represent a large enough coalition to win elections, really, which I think we're seeing all over Europe. That there's been a sort of revival of parties of the right, the moderate right anyway, driven by a resistance not a hostility to liberalism as such, I think, but a hostility to the kind of excesses of liberalism. I mean, Douglas Murray uses this metaphor of the kind of, the sort of liberal train is pulling up into the station, and then somebody presses their foot on the accelerator and the train kind of roars on. I mean, you see this in the kind of more extreme manifestations of woke politics, in transgender and so on. I mean, just a quick second point about knowledge and higher education and all of that. I mean, I think there is this idea that the more people that enter higher education, by which I mean proper, as it were, classical higher education of 3-4 year degree courses focused very much on academic, sort of abstract academic ideas. As I say, the definition of higher education is very different in different countries. It often includes basically all forms of post-school education. I'm not quite sure what the position, how you're using the terms higher education, but obviously almost everybody needs to go through some form of post-school education these days. But I think there is this false notion, the more people you send to proper classical higher education, somehow the higher your level of innovation, the higher your level of kind of insight as a society. I think this is based on a complete fallacy. The number of people that produce new knowledge in any area of life, whether it's science or technology or even the social sciences, when the people who really produce new knowledge is always very, very small. And I don't think there is a relationship between new knowledge and the number of people you send into higher education. Actually, we, as European societies, we were probably innovating far more in the 60s and the 70s when hardly anybody went through classical higher education. So I think that is a false idea, and I think one of the problems. I mean, somebody was talking about how, with women, particularly women in the more peripheral parts of Norway, want to go to university. But one of the reasons they want to go to university is because I imagine more and more of your decent jobs have become graduate only. I don't know what the position in Norway is, but in the UK, to become a nurse, you now have to, have a degree. Indeed, you've had to have a degree for about 10 years. I don't actually think, I mean, there is some evidence that hospitals with higher numbers of nurses with degrees have better outcomes. It's quite contested though. And I think the important thing here, to prevent too much polarization between, as it were, anywheres and somewheres, is to actually reduce the number of graduate-only jobs. Many jobs. I mean, Reidar's farmer friend is probably an extremely capable man. The fact that he doesn't have a higher education credentialization of his ability doesn't make him any less able. Like I say, it's really only quite a small proportion of sort of 18, 19-year-olds are highly able academically or have a great hunger for intellectual knowledge. It's a tiny proportion, I mean, most of us here probably have children. I mean, most of them have probably gone to university. Most of them are not intellectuals. Most of them are not interested in ideas. You go to university because you have to, because so many jobs require you to have a degree. I mean, we've got ourselves into a sort of treadmill of credentialization, and we need to. This is the theme of my most recent book, Head, Hand, Heart. We need to spread the value. We need a wider definition of merit. Our definition of merit and meritocracy has become far too narrowly focused on cognitive ability and movement into sort of cognitive-based professions, and I think that's become very, very damaging, and is exacerbating the political tension between anywheres and somewheres, which is and there's a resolving or finding common ground between these worldviews is obviously the main purpose of politics in modern times now. There will always be anywheres and somewheres. I mean, it's sort of, and there's a kind of anywheres and somewhere divide in all of us as individuals too, and it's resolving that. And one of the ways we resolve it, I think, is by a wider definition of what it is to live a successful life, by reducing the number, say, of graduate-only professions, or at least keeping open other routes, non-university routes into respected, well-paid jobs. I think is a goal that we can all agree on.
David, thank you very much. I have to interrupt you there. We are 5 minutes past schedule. Thank you very much for this last point also, even though it hurts us a bit as university teachers to hear that we are not all that useful and we can't expect to recruit the majority of young people with good reason. But you made some very valid points towards the end there, and we thank you, and we thank all the other participants and people who asked questions, and Jens, who arranged the whole thing. Thank you very much.